Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 news. After failing to win the Italian Grand Prix, major questions circulating today as to what the future of Ferrari actually looks like. Mattia Binotto, former team principal now at Audi, is apparently going shopping for some of the top names at the Scuderia, and he is managing to draw them away. Multiple employees, top level employees at that, leaving Ferrari it seems in the near future, and according to some rumours circulating online today, things might be even more problematic for the team than just that. Where do we go from here? Very much into your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Let's get right into things because we're going to start with Carlos Sainz, who is in the background of this image behind the two Ferrari drivers following the Italian Grand Prix. His penalty that he got for Lawson crashing into him back at the Dutch Grand Prix was very controversial. I would argue that Sainz was unfairly penalised then. I think it was a racing incident. I would say that Ollie Behrman was unfairly penalised against Sainz at the Italian Grand Prix. Now, a few days ago, before the Italian Grand Prix weekend began, Williams confirmed they would be doing a right of appeal, effectively, against Sainz's penalty. Haas might want to think about something similar, maybe, for the Italian Grand Prix incident at the Roger chicane as well, but that appeal for Sainz is set to be heard later on this week. We'll get an update, it seems, from the FIA, or they will just dismiss it and say, yes, we know the rules are absolutely terrible, but it is what it is. Now, if you're a Max Verstappen fan, could he still win the title? The answer is yes. The reality is he's near enough 90 points behind. He needs to gain near enough 12 points every race weekend. I think it's like 11.75 points he needs per race weekends to win the title. He's 94 points behind in the standings, and this is how it stands. However, if Max were to win every race, now it's not going to happen, but I know that there are some Max fans, Red Bull fans that are thinking, well, you know what, if he can win as he did in Monza, and look, you got to say, he's only got, what, 3 wins this year, but they've all been spectacular. Japan, Imola, that lap 1 move, and then as we saw in Monza, winning everything from now to the end of the season, pretty unlikely. But if it was to happen, and the sprints, then Piastri would need only one real stinker for it to go the other way. Okay, let's say he DNFs in Azerbaijan, then it becomes possible. So effectively this analysis here from Dan is to say, look, if Max wins everything and the McLaren drivers share second and third every weekend, as long as there's one DNF in there somewhere for Piastri, then, you know, this type of championship conclusion is technically still on. But I think you can look at some of these tracks. I mean, you're looking at even Abu Dhabi, I would say, but certainly somewhere maybe Austin could go okay. Singapore will be a major question mark for the Red Bull. There's a couple of these tracks that should suit the Red Bull pretty well. There's a couple of them that I think are the chances of Max being able to do anything there are pretty slim. So, look, realistically, it is still a fight between the top 2 in the championship. But lately, things have got pretty controversial, and there was a lot more talk about this yesterday in the media, so we're going to dive into it a little bit again. Piastri's pit stops in the last 5 pit stops total have been pretty okay. So, out of those 5, Piastri, if you add the 5 up, it comes to 12.54, so you're talking roughly a 2.5 second pit stop on average. Norris, significantly more than that. In fact, his pit stops are near enough in the 4-second average range over the last 5. That's, yes, he had 4 seconds more than Piastri in Monza alone. But even if you take that 4 seconds away, Norris's pit stops have still been on average half a second slower over the last few Grand Prix. In fact, if you look at the last few Grand Prix times, in Silverstone, he had a 4.64 second stop. In Spa, he had a 3.6. In Zandvoort, he had a 4.8. And then in Monza, it got even worse. So, like I said yesterday that I'm not going to get into these sabotage discussions, but it is certainly notable that in the last, 5 or so Grand Prix, there have been at least 3 to 4 very notable slower pit stops for Norris. Now, it's not like McLaren have been super on the ball with Piastri either, but it was just such a key strength for them. And really why this matters is that going forwards, if this continues to happen, because clearly their pit stops have not exactly been spectacular as they were last year pretty much every single time. If this continues, not even just for Lando, but assuming that it happens for Piastri as well at some point, then again, it will open some serious questions. If Piastri has a 2.8 second stop and Norris has a 2.2 second stop, and as a result of that, Norris comes out of the pit lane and he's within DRS of Piastri and therefore makes the overtake happen, would Piastri be within his rights to say, look guys, you made a bit of a mistake there, you lost me half a second, that was enough for me to therefore lose the position, so I think Lando's got to give it back. I think part of the reason why Piastri yielded to the call that McLaren controversially made at the Italian Grand Prix was so that in effect he has that, joker in the back pocket to potentially play at some point. I'm fully convinced if this championship goes down to the wire, if Norris closes in a little bit on Piastri in the coming rounds, when this type of situation happens again, which it will, either from a strategy perspective or a mistake perspective or a pit stop or whatever the case is, you could get really technical with it, at some point, one of these guys is just going to ignore the orders. And that's exactly what they should do. Mercedes tried with Hamilton and Rosberg to tell the drivers what to do, but they were within their rights, and Mercedes understood that the drivers don't necessarily have to listen to them. And there was multiple occasions where the drivers in that title fight, and it got very heated, did not listen to the team. And look, did Mercedes still win the Constructors? Yes, they did. So this is why I think there's been so much, maybe vitriol is too harsh, but a lot of the journalists and people in the space are particularly frustrated with McLaren. Now, you could also be frustrated at Lando or at Piastri for yielding in this scenario, but I can understand the frustration of the fans who want to see a real, gritty, raw title fight. But it feels like they are neutering their drivers to some degree, right? And Ollie Harden says here, are they title protagonists or are they puppets to what McLaren want to do? Now, I think that only lasts so long. Look, if this was for the race win, I think Piastri would certainly have more heavily considered whether he yielded. It was a 6-point swing in the ends. It could have been a 14-point swing had it been for the win. That would have been a pretty big deal, I will say. And there's been plenty of writers giving their opinion on, let's say, the team-first culture that Stella is promoting at McLaren. And it's all fine and sunshine and rainbows when the team's winning everything, they're getting 1-2s in all the races, and their drivers are not so, just alpha energy that they will not listen at all, but eventually that will happen. David Coulthard sat down with Mark Webber actually, and Coulthard said, look, I don't expect you to comment on this, Mark, about the team orders, but I mean, look, you can see his reaction there on his face when he's like, this is what Webber had to say. He didn't say anything, but this is his reaction to the team orders. Clearly he's like, yeah, I don't know so much about that one. Even David Coulthard was on the receiving end of some of those McLaren antics before they were called the Papaya rules. So some discussion in the media. The Italian, with the support of Chief Executive Zak Brown, has managed the historically impossible by neutering the selfish alpha tendency among closely matched intra-team title rivals. This is the shiniest, nicey enmity in Formula 1 memory, boring for an observer, an act of managerial aplomb by Stella. He has diffused many a ticking bomb, but this was reasonableness gone too far. Ollie Harden, we said, labelled Piastri a fool for submitting to it. It's not his responsibility to dig his teammate out of the hole. So I think we're getting a lot of, because it feels like this title fight could be more interesting, but instead all we're talking about is bloody Papaya rules, right? Rather than the actual rivalry between the two drivers. As I say, I think that will come if things continue to be very competitive between them. I don't know about Lando, but I have no doubt that if Piastri needs or feels like he needs to refuse a team order in order to ensure that he wins the title, I have no doubt that Piastri will do that if he feels like the time is right to do so. And hopefully we see that happen in reality, because I think that would certainly be a storyline. And it does feel like, as much as people don't like the way that McLaren are handling this, it is bubbling up quite nicely, right? Because the more that you do this, the more that McLaren play the games, the more inevitable it becomes that at some point one of their drivers says actually no. And all of a sudden that, blows the whole thing wide open potentially, because it's an even bigger deal to make that decision as a driver when they have towed the party line at this point. So let's talk about Ferrari. This was, I thought, quite a remarkable shot from presumably the second lap of the Italian Grand Prix at this point. We know that Max Verstappen has yielded to Lando Norris in the lead, but I thought it was pretty crazy to look at it from this trackside angle at the Ascari chicane, because you can see after Norris comes through and after Verstappen comes through, this absolutely massive moment that Leclerc has here. We didn't catch this in real time, but Leclerc had just a huge snap coming through Ascari and did pretty well I mean, look how sideways he is here. Like, he did pretty well to save it, to be perfectly honest, and well, keeps his car going in the right direction just about. But clearly that Ferrari, not the easiest thing to handle this year. Now, it was not terrible for Ferrari, but given their expectations at their home Grand Prix in Monza, it was far below what they would have expected. Leclerc battled hard early and, as is usual with the SF25, suffered with some overheating and therefore had to lift and coast for nearly 10 laps to bring everything back under control. I think Hamilton had to do some lift coast as well. Even a few on-track fights made the car feel unstable as if he was sliding on ice. Well, we saw all about that. And yes, he had a smaller rear wing, had lower downforce as a result. But let's be honest, right? That was not enough to explain some of the lack of cornering performance that Ferrari definitely had this weekend. Now, Fred Vasseur was pretty defensive of Hamilton. I mean, Hamilton was solid, right? Like, he was good in qualifying, he was good in the race, and Hamilton had one of his better weekends probably so far. Of course, the penalty prevented him from really making great progress. But Vasseur says, Russell's been a couple of times on the podium. We can expect Hamilton to be on the podium as well. At the beginning of the race, the pace was better than Charles. The mood was better. And Hamilton was pretty optimistic after the weekend, saying that things felt better. He feels like he's understood a little bit more how to deal with what he describes as a pretty alien driving style that this car requires. He's able to get better to Leclerc or closer to Leclerc as a result. And Hamilton was generally pretty happy with his weekends. But it's kind of a tough one when Hamilton's pretty happy with the weekends, pretty happy with the result, pretty optimistic about the rest of the season, and he was 6th and Leclerc was 4th, right? Like, it's really not a great sign of what Ferrari were expecting going into this season anyway, when we thought they could be championship winners, certainly championship contenders, and the fact of the matter is they're fighting hard with Mercedes for seconds, and if it wasn't for Antonelli being a rookie, then that fight as well might be far, worse for Ferrari than it actually is. Some Ferrari fans would say, oh, well, you want to be 3rd because then you can get the testing time and the extra points and all that stuff, and there might be some truth to that, but of course the team, they want the bonuses. Now, let's talk about Ferrari and some of the drama, because this got very interesting today. There was an Auto Racer article that came out describing, and this is a pretty interesting even headline here from De Kessa. A first phase and technical cycle comes to an end. Ferrari has decided on a total integration of the F1 projects in Maranello, with full power going to this guy, Joao Thierry. Now, this is because one of their other top guys is out of the door. Audi interested in taking on key figures that are leaving. So I'll leave the entire article linked down below. But the bottom line is Mattia Binotto used to work for Ferrari, as we know. He knows a thing or two about the guys over at that organisation, and he wants a piece of the pie. Sauber, as in Audi as it's going to be, have recently recruited about 200 new technicians, and Ferrari itself will be replacing some of its former Maranello counterparts with personnel arriving from Viry-Châtillon, so of course some of the Alpine guys that are leaving. But the bottom line is that there are some Ferrari staff members leaving, and Audi want to go and get them. The key name mentioned in the article is this guy Wolf Zimmerman. So Wolf Zimmerman is this fella on the right hand side. He was with Lotus for quite a long time. I actually went on his LinkedIn right here. Here you go. So it wants me to have a look at Benedetta Vigna, but anyway, this is Wolf Zimmerman, and he's been with Ferrari now, head of ICE research and development since 2014. He's been with Ferrari. So he's been there obviously a long time. Maybe it makes sense. He wants to move on, new challenge, whatever. But he's a big name, and this is a big deal because he will part ways with the team by mutual agreement, is what the article says. Audi is definitely interested in these candidates. The German engineer will leave Ferrari after 11 years, with the Maranello team deciding to fully integrate the power unit project, granting full powers to that other guy we mentioned. And it seems that Audi might be interested in trying to get Zimmerman to work for their project instead, which might make a fair bit of sense given the German thing, and he could be potentially their lead on their development in due course. And even Ferrari's new top guy on the power unit side is under fire as well. Now, he prefers to stay for the time being, but that could be a problem. So the bottom line is Zimmerman was effectively in charge of this project, and now he's gone. So is that because it's not going to plan, or is it, there could be multiple reasons for this. It might not be the worst thing ever. The point is, when you've just gone into a new power unit cycle, and these regulations are far from straightforward, and your head of the project effectively walks out or leaves or whatever, that can never be an ideal scenario given the timing, because there will still be some development there to come. And even in the next couple of years, we're going to move away from the 50-50, we think, go back to maybe a 90-10 V8 or whatever, where the ICE is more important. And, Zimmerman, you'd think would be a pretty good guy to have on board for that. But apparently not. Understandably, there was lots of reaction to say, well, this isn't looking good. It doesn't look very good for Ferrari because they effectively turned down Newey because Newey wanted too much power, but has that really worked out? Look, if it doesn't go to plan for Hamilton next year, then yeah, that will be a shame for him and for Ferrari, but yeah, he's won his championships, right, would be the argument. But for Charles Leclerc, there have been big questions as to what it will take for Charles to stay or to go. Charles, of course, publicly very much says, look, there's no doubt that he's committed to Ferrari, but behind the scenes, there have been some questions about that. Now, the article describes how there are other individuals leaving Ferrari. Now, there was an interesting post made. Again, I will say, take this all with a massive pinch of salt, because this is just like a random account here on Twitter with no profile picture, LH44 fan in the bio, but has made a load of tweets, and, the tweets don't seem totally deranged, so we will at least get into it, because this account says that they have sources that will soon bring this stuff to light. So, look, if this does come to light at some point, if this is even real, then, we talked about it here first. Now, anyway, this guy says, let's be clear that some people at Ferrari are leaving immediately because they have had their contracts terminated for racially abusing Lewis, not because of pay and conditions, as a guise of protecting the Ferrari brand to stop Lewis from speaking out about it. So the argument here would be that Hamilton, when Hamilton made his thoughts on, there's been interesting things happening behind the scenes, the argument is, and even some other people have said this, not to the extent of, racial abuse or anything of that level, but there have been suggestions that many, certainly some of the, let's say, even engineers or technical team or whatever it is at Ferrari, not super on board with Hamilton joining, not necessarily because he's Hamilton, but maybe because they perceive Ferrari to have done this as a PR move rather than anything for the competitive intentions. There's arguments both ways on it, but it doesn't feel like the whole team behind the scenes at Ferrari are fully aligned. If they were, I don't think Hamilton would have made some of those comments that he made earlier this season on strange things happening behind the scenes. Now, the account says the proof is there, the NDAs have been signed, and a big F1 account will shed light on this matter in due course. I never lied about this, it's very serious, and the said employees of Ferrari are to be fired immediately after the summer break. That was what was said, and again, we talked today about rumours that, some people are being let go, but of course, they're not necessarily going to say why. So, there were loads of tweets in this account that I'll leave the link down below if you guys want to read through everything he had to say, but he did have to say this: Ferrari already have the screenshots from my thread post, because a lot of the stuff got deleted here, and it's out of the FIA's jurisdiction. It's an internal matter. I never deleted the post, which usually tells everyone I'm confident it is the truth from my source. So, take it as you will. The key point is there are some big names at Ferrari leaving that team in the near future. That could be somewhat problematic. Then the potential secondary thing is that some of these individuals leaving could be involved in the circumstances which just, slightly more serious in many respects. But look, who knows, right? I guess we'll stay tuned for this one, give it a few weeks, give it a couple of months, see if anything comes out to this effect. But I think it's been the opinion of many that there have been some things behind the scenes at Ferrari, some comments that have been made publicly, which have been somewhat surprising if everything was sunshine and rainbows. Of course, from the outside, from the perspective of the PR department, everything is beautiful, right? Doing the great videos with the team, they're, continuing to farm impressions on social media, but maybe there's more to this than meets the eye. So tweet your thoughts in the comments. Just one final thing. George Russell says that he talked about the group chat, because people were like, oh, are the drivers constantly messaging each other in this chat? That would be very unlikely, right? At the end of the day, these guys, some of them are friendly, but they are rivals, right? These guys aren't here for a jolly, right? This is war at the end of the day. There's They're not just going to be dropping messages left, right and centre. Although Lewis, this season especially, is just here for for a good time, I think. And yeah, he's just dropping some memes in the group chat, which George Russell says. But mostly, there's not too much discussed apart from serious driver talk. So very much interested to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.